Next we have Trish Gibson, who's a passionate gardener and plantswoman, but she's also the biographer of Brenda Colvin. Trish.
Good afternoon. My story begins here in Bristol in the spring of 2002, and I am quite honestly shocked to realise that that's 23 years ago. I was nearing the end of my MA at Bristol University. I was searching for a subject for my dissertation. I'd very much enjoyed the 20th century part of the course. We'd been to Sutton Place to see Geoffrey Jellicoe's design there. This is the Magritte Walk. I'd read the Landscape Design Trust's books on both Jellicoe and Sylvia Crowe. There were mentions of Brenda Colvin. She sounded rather intriguing, but there wasn't much said about her. And then I found Sheila Harvey's Reflections on Landscape, and the chapter in that on Brenda Colvin by one Hal Moggridge. Otherwise, I couldn't find out much about her, and I wanted to find out more, so I asked if I could go and see Hal. He kindly agreed to see me, and I made my first visit to Little Peacocks at Filkins. As a mere student of landscape and garden history, I was rather nervous, but Hal put me at ease. We met in the temporary office, which I gather should be called the Wooden Shack, according to Tom Stuart Smith. But Colvin had that built in 1965, and I think it's still there today. He talked to some of her more important work, the larger landscape projects, power stations, Trimpley Reservoir, Aldershot, and her commitment to the Landscape Institute. And he mentioned some of her later gardens, the Manor House at Sutton Courtenay. This is a sort of wild apart grass walks planted with bulbs and wildflowers, and also her skill with planting, the unusual combinations that she started using, which are now quite commonplace. He gave me a copy of the obituary he'd written in the Garden magazine, and he talked about her. In his words, a delightful person, but very fierce. His profound knowledge of her and her work was obvious. And we were still in the Wooden Shack when he said, "There's a little book of her jobs." He proceeded to get out a step stool and brought down from the top of the filing cabinet, I hope you don't mind me revealing this, Hal, a black bin liner. And in there was her garden's notebook. Now this, as I was to discover, was a researcher's dream. It was an extraordinary record of her work that she'd begun with job number 1 in 1922. There it is, Lulworth, for W.B. Gladstone, I think was a cousin of hers. It was Stair House above, on a cliff top above Lulworth Cove, the bleakest sight you could imagine. The book has 41 pages of entries. The last entry was job number 675 in 1980. Bizarrely, the book she'd chosen in 1922 was just full at the time of her death in 1981. Also in the bin liner, there were 2 small albums, sorry, I've gone back one there. There were 2 small albums of contact prints of her photos from the later 1930s and post-war, some with her comments on them. Here, ill-drudged tree planting, existing trees adequate. And this one I like, ghastly garage. These comments gave quite an insight into her beliefs and character. So in the bin liner and in her desk in the next door office, there was more. Some of her lecture notes, articles she'd written for the Landscape Institute Journal, more photographs, other notebooks. It was a treasure trove, and I was able to look through it all and take copies away with me. What I saw in that office was in fact the very beginning of what is now the Brenda Colvin archive, long before it was gathered together and housed at Merle in Reading in 2014. Several months later, I completed the dissertation. That's Brenda Colvin, that's my dissertation. And with some trepidation, I sent a copy to Hal and let him know that I'd found a publisher keen to take on an expanded version as a book. Hal's response was encouraging, complimentary, but he quite accurately spotted that the weaker section of the dissertation was the chapter on her large-scale landscape design. I'm not a landscape architect. I'm a gardener. I'm not sure whether I dare call myself a plantswoman in this company. And anyway, that had shown, but he generously offered to assist with more information, extracts from reports, and even specially prepared plans. He also offered to help with relevant illustrations. And he concluded, I could hardly believe it, with the words, "Your book just might be a classic." Wow, that was encouragement. I was a rather anxious first-time author, and that was such a boost. In my working life, I'd edited other people's books, written magazine articles, but never previously contemplated writing a whole book myself. Needless to say, a year or two or more passed as I worked on all the necessary research into all the gardens, her earlier years and her family, her writings and so on. It was a long process. And then there was time spent visiting a number of those gardens and interviewing various people who'd known and worked with her, including John Brooks, Anthony Pasley and Peter Youngman. And then we went and moved house a couple of times, and that didn't help. But Hal was true to his word and supplied me with data for the large-scale work, all meticulously, neatly marked up as in this example, and this is just a tiny sample of what he sent me. Eventually I was able to send him a draft of the completed book, still a bit on tenterhooks, but he said it was a delightful book with a lovely readable style. Once again, really encouraging. There are a number of small points that he noted, but more importantly, he saved me from making one huge gaffe. I'd spoken to one garden owner who told me how Brenda Colvin had visited their garden, walking with a stick, accompanied by Hal, and had made very complimentary comments about the view of the landscape, and had therefore agreed to take the job on. It seemed like a lovely story for a prologue, how late in her life Brenda Colvin had taken on a major garden design job. But no, tactfully, diplomatically, Hal had saved the bad news for last and was letting me down gently. Apparently the story was a bit of an invention. Yes, Hal had visited with Brenda Colvin, but in fact it was he who had designed the garden, and at the time of their visit, there'd been no view at all. Major change of plan. The revised prologue now told the story of a secret surprise party given to celebrate Brenda Colvin's CBE. The invitation sent out to people by staff included an embargo on notice this occasion to Miss Colvin before the end of February. People were not to say a word to her. Obviously, to a certain degree, they were scared of that fierce side of her nature. She might just have refused to have the party. And I ought to just mention at this point that the generosity and encouragement shown by Hal was also shown by Hal Moggridge and Chris and Stephanie Carter, who all willingly shared their memories of Brenda Colvin. So my thanks to them. So far, so good. But here's me still at my desk. A problem had developed. My original publisher, who'd given me every expectation that he'd deliver, then let me down really badly with endless delays and inaction. The thought of all that work going to waste, all those reports, plans, and illustrations that Hal had diligently provided coming to nothing, was terrible. Fortunately, unlike some, I had a contract specifying publication with a year, so eventually I was able to move on, and with Hal's approval, I took the book to Francis Lincoln, and it was finally published in 2011. So I'm speaking here today in what's known as the advisor and advocate section of the day, but I would say that Hal has been much more for me. He was always so enthusiastic and encouraging, as well as being tremendously helpful in very practical ways, contributing so much to the book's coverage of Brenda Colvin's landscape work. In fact, he was a biographer's dream, measured, responsive, gentle with any criticism, and completely open with his memories and assessments of Brenda Colvin. So a heartfelt thank you, Hal. And I just wanted to say thank you, Folar, for the chance to say that.